Let's get to the fifth part, discussing about prefrontal cortex lesions and how they can inform us to have a better understanding about prefrontal cortex functions. I'm going to kind of remind you about what we have discussed about what John Hollings Jackson was telling us in terms of the susceptibility in prefrontal cortex for injuries, and how prefrontal cortex could be susceptible to different levels of injuries, whether it's going to be just traumatic injuries, because it is just in the front of the face. So, I mean, obviously it is going to be very susceptible whenever we have a direct sort of crash to any place that is going to be involved in those sort of injuries. And even from the evolutionary perspective, when we have something that is pretty unique, pretty new in the process of evolution, that is going to be more susceptible to the injuries as well. And we have discussed that the process of evolution is saying the same issues in terms of the process of development in the prefrontal cortex. Okay, we can divide injuries in prefrontal cortex, whether it is dorsolateral prefrontal part or orbitofrontal part or ventromedial prefrontal part. So these pieces could have different sort of outcomes in terms of the injuries. You probably have heard about a famous case of Phineas Gage and how this poor gentleman has been affected by a specific brain injury with significant, let's say, trauma to the prefrontal cortex. It's really hard to say it was just a ventromedial prefrontal part, because it's just the whole entire prefrontal cortex that was being injured by that specific unique type of accident. And people have explored that, and we have discussed about that in terms of the behavior implication of that injury, in terms of changing in personality and what we knew from this person. And it is quite amazing that I think what we talk about personality, a big part of the personality is related to futuristic cognition. And why, I will discuss about that in terms of how personality in reality is mainly related to a different sort of futuristic cognitive processes. So we know that this guy had a significant personality changes after this injury. And people try to explore that specific sort of injury now from a modern neuroscience perspective. And there are different really famous figures in terms of trying to explore to evaluate that, let's say, injury in modern cognitive neuroscience terms. And two of the really famous figures, I'm going to kind of talk more about what they are doing in this field, are Damasio family, or what we have Antonio Damasio and Hannah Damasio, who is Antonio's wife. So they had significant contribution to this field, and both of them are super nice people. So I visited their institute, Brain and Creativity Institute in USC, and I had a talk, and both of them were in my talk, and I was, to be honest, very kind of anxious to give a talk. It goes back to many years ago, and yeah, I will tell you a little bit about their story, but I've been really inspired by their personality and the level of humbleness that they had in terms of receiving young students and giving comments and discussion. So it was pretty impressive. So they have been, let me just give you kind of a full story about the prefrontal cortex and their contribution to the field. They have reported, I'm talking about right now Antonio Damasio, it goes back to 1985. So it is something like 35 years ago. They reported a case, they called the case EVR, with bilateral, orbital, and ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesion. And the case was reported 35 years ago from University of Iowa. And those who have never been in kind of different places in US, this is Iowa, which is what we call in the Midwest of US. And I mean, this is where I'm located right now in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We are located here. And it's something like from here to Iowa, it is something like, I think, 8 hours drive from here to Iowa. And they have been working on University of Iowa. And University of Iowa is really famous in terms of having a really successful department of neuroscience. And there are many people who have started from University of Iowa. Now they technically moved to LA and they work in USC, University of Southern California. So the case that they reported was an interesting case in terms of the case had a completely normal developmental milestone, good socioeconomic status, high intelligence, very successful businessman. And the case at the age of 35, after a very brief period of personality change and visual disturbances, they found a large meningioma in what we call cribriform plate. And cribriform plate is exactly this bone here on the top of your nasal cavity. And they found a meningioma here, right here. And it is pretty much a frequent area to develop meningioma. And meningioma are tumors from meninges, so they are developed from the basically covering sheets of the brain. And most of the time they are well demarcated, they are not invading different brain tissues, and they can easily be removed from the brain if they can be diagnosed quite early. So it was completely removed by surgery, but the problem started from this point, because this gentleman, after his tumor was removed, he went back to the business and kind of the normal life. And over the course of something like a few years, he lost his job, he lost his family, and basically he became a really unsuccessful person in the kind of normal life that he had before. And he came back to University of Iowa, and he was asking a document for his insurance company to compensate for the problems that he had with the job and family and the other things in his life, to be able to have compensation from insurance company, kind of saying that all these problems are coming from the brain tumor that he had before. And then these people in University of Iowa, that they have a really strong behavioral neurology department, they evaluated him with different sorts of cognitive tasks the cognitive tasks that were available something like 40 years ago. And I mean, almost all of the tasks that we already have, cognitive tasks that we already have, most of them were available something like 40 years ago as well. Things like Wisconsin card sorting tasks, different sort of working memory tasks, language tasks. And they have evaluated this case, EVR, for all these tasks. And none of them was impaired. So all of those tasks were basically normal. And they didn't have any task to be able to evaluate the deficit that this gentleman had in that period of time. So they started to think about how they might be able to develop a task that would address this guy's deficits and being able to evaluate that. At that period of time, a gentleman, Antoine Bechara, he was working at that department. So I think he was a PhD student at that period of time in University of Iowa. So he developed a task under the name of a gambling task in University of Iowa. And this what you are seeing here is kind of a snapshot from the task that we developed in Iran. It goes back to 1999. We received a version of the task from Antoine Bechara. I think it goes back to 1998, something like that. And we developed a version in Iran. And now the task is being named as Iowa Gambling Task because it got really famous afterwards and people have published a lot with this task. So now it is being named under Iowa Gambling Task. And right now it is even being commercialized. So the task is commercialized right now. So it is, I mean, there are some copyright issues if you want to use that. But technically, this is the initial version. And as you can see here, these are our names in Persian language when we have developed them before it goes back to many years. When I was a medical student and I was working beside the medical school in the Institute for Cognitive Science Studies in Tehran. So we developed the task and how the task was working. The task was giving people 4 decks of cards. And people were supposed to select cards from these decks. We had both the manual or actual cards developed, and also we developed the computerized version, as you can see here. And there are instructions. These instructions are in Persian language, but those who cannot read the Persian language, it's just about the win, loss, and net win. And it is just asking, you can select one card from the top of one of these decks. And you can go and, let's say, select a card from deck A, and it gives you an kind of when you take the card, on the other side of the card there would be a kind of a result in terms of win or loss, or win and loss. So you can have those responses, and it would be recorded to your final result, and you give feedback, you receive feedbacks. And some of the cards are better than the others, but some of the cards are not really good. So you need to develop a skill in terms of, okay, which card is better and which card is not. So you go for some other selections. So for example, you select another card from the deck C, you would be winning then, and then you select another card from the deck B, and then you would lose something like a kind of a large amount of money, and the net amount of money that you would have would be lower than before. So you receive feedback. So it's something like a game with win and loss. Over the time, when you want to select from one of those cards, you need to think about, okay, what would be the consequence of this card? What would be the response of the card? So you would start to develop a sort of kind of a futuristic cognition in terms of, okay, what I'm gonna kind of receive with selecting this card. What would be the consequences of selecting this card? And they realized that this task could differentiate the case EVR that we had before from normal people. So they realized that this task could be a really good kind of discriminating factor to be able to diagnose this case with ventromedial prefrontal cortex or orbitofrontal cortex injury. And in kind of the behind logic, the logic that we have behind this task, the card A and B would give you larger wins, but they also have very large losses. But card C and D would give you smaller wins, meanwhile really small losses. And over the time, if you select from C and D, you would be successful in making more win compared to the kind of win and losses, that the kind of having higher win but having higher losses in cards A and B. And people over the time would shift to selecting from C and D and not A and B. So that the final kind of score would be just C plus D minus A plus B. That was the let's say the score of the task. And those who have, let's say, problems with this part of the cortex, they have higher in this and lower in this, and so that their score would be finally lower. So this is what we call Iowa gambling task. And people realize that it's going to be a good task for measuring how brain is how orbitofrontal cortex or ventromedial prefrontal cortex would be functioning. But how this is going to be important for us right now with the discussions that we have. When you do this task, you would go through different levels. First of all, you are just receiving rewards and punishment, so you do not have any idea what is happening. And then over time, you start to develop a sort of a hunch, a guess. Thinking, okay, it seems that card A is better than B, C better than. So you start to develop a sort of a hunch. And then you can get, at the end of the day, to the, let's say, the conceptual level. By conceptual level, it means that you know that C and D are better than A and B. And that is the conceptual level. And you get to the let's say, the rules of the game. It's amazing that even 30% of the normal people do not get to the level 4. So many of the people who are doing these tasks, they never get to the point that they realize what is the rule behind the task. But they still perform really well in terms of moving mainly towards the C and D and not A and B. And the question is why? People have done many studies on this over the time. But one of the theories that people have is that when you are in the first steps of developing a concept about what is really happening here, whenever you want to go to select from cards A or B, if we record from your skin, if we put electrodes over your skin and measure what we call a skin conductance response, changing the skin conductance that you have, there is what they call anticipatory skin conductance response. And what is anticipatory skin conductance response? It means that when you want to go and select from A and B, you have something like a level of shock in your body that is alarming you that you are going to do something that is not right. Even having a hunch whether A and B is better or C or D is better. So even before getting to a level of cognition to know about what is going to happen in the future if I select this card, this system is developing a skill to be able, a level of understanding about what is going to happen if I select this card and alarming you before getting to this point of selecting them. So they call them anticipatory SCR. And they realize that this anticipatory SCR is a really important factor in terms of avoiding you from selecting from A and B and directing you towards using C and D cards. And I mean, I can probably talk for hours about the clinical implications of this and what are the clinical populations that people realize that they do not function really well on these tasks because of lack of, let's say, anticipatory SCRs. And now with the accumulation of evidence in the field, there are still some debates in terms of, I mean, is this the best way to explain that or not? But it is something that you can go and review and learn about that. But this is quite an interesting and impressive story in terms of being able to develop a task that is able to differentiate people with ventromedial and orbitofrontal cortex dysfunctions from those who have dorsolateral prefrontal cortex dysfunction. Because if you have injury in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, your working memory would be impaired. Your executive function would be impaired. Your many other, let's say, more cognitive aspect of your futuristic cognition would be impaired. But those aspects would not be impaired very much with ventromedial and orbitofrontal cortex lesions. But orbitofrontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions are going to impair the affective, motivational aspects of this process. It is futuristic process in terms of whether we are going to have a really good results from this action in terms of reward and punishment or not. And this futuristic cognition is going to be sort of evaluated with this Iowa gambling task, which is an interesting task to learn about. And there are many complexities and interesting aspects about Iowa gambling task that is kind of evaluating sort of different level of cognition compared to the more, let's say, cognitive aspect of cognitive process, or cold cognitive aspect of cognitive process, compared to what we have with reward and punishment, which are mainly warm or hot cognitive functions. Okay, so that was the story of that process. And we have done, several studies, and I told you, I was presenting one of the, or some of the studies that we have done at that period of time in Iran when I was presenting. I think I was a PhD student on cognitive neuroscience in Iran. I was presenting in USC. That was kind of lots of really good memories, and I'm still thankful for their support. And there are some other kind of colleagues and friends there that were really supportive. I should mention Dr. Dehqani. He was a faculty member there at that period of time, and he was really supportive as well. So I do not forget their supports, that they helped me to get to that point.